Hello, and welcome to week one of Developmentally Appropriate Books for Storytime. I'm your instructor, Elaine Zarnecki, and you can read a little bit more about me on the course site, but to give you a little introduction, I'm a literacy consultant and I'm a former elementary school teacher and reading specialist. And I've been working with public libraries since 2001, back in the early days of Every Child Ready to Read or ECRR. And most of my work has been in the area of early literacy. So the topic for this course is near and dear to my heart, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you in the month ahead. So, why don't we take a look now at how the course is going to be structured? I know you may have explored the website already, but this slide is a screen capture of the overview of week one, and you'll see that for every week. So we can kind of take a look at this together. It's going to look similar for every week. As you can see, the focus for the week and the learning objectives are outlined here. So for week one, we're going to focus on building an understanding of developmentally appropriate practices for story times, along with an understanding of the best practices for early literacy development as outlined in ECRR. So, you know, of course, that there's more to choosing books for story time than just knowing your collection. It's important to understand how to choose books that foster school readiness and literacy skills, as well as books that cultivate an understanding of diverse cultures and traditions. So, in this class, you're going to get hands-on practice connecting current and classic children's books to the developmental ages and stages of infants, toddlers, 2-year-olds, preschoolers, the whole age range there. And we're going to focus on intentionally choosing books based on their connection to the early literacy skills and the 5 best practices of ECRR, their connection also to fostering school readiness skills, and their connections to diverse family cultures and traditions. So if we take a look back at our overview here, when you see where it says week one at a glance, that's just to give you an idea of what's expected for the week. There's always going to be a listing of the different perhaps videos or readings or websites that you're supposed to explore. And there will always be a video lecture each week. So that will be part of our week's learning together. So I hope this gives you a good overview of what to expect. And each week I'll turn on my camera to say hello, and I may also post some additional kind of catch-up videos as the course progresses. But for now, I'm going to pause for a minute and turn my camera off, and we'll start launching into the content. Okay, so let me. So, the first thing we want to take a look at this week is talking about developmentally appropriate practice, or DAP. So, as a brief overview of that, we want to keep in mind that young children have unique learning processes, much like we do as adults. For young children, they have a very unique approach to their learning, and it can be along the lines of a child may be more of an auditory learner or a visual learner or kinesthetic or movement or any combination of those, but just keeping in mind that they do have unique learning processes for their younger ages. And secondly, we want to think about the fact that developmentally appropriate practice for young children should really be about making sure they're having fun while they're learning. They will tend to remember and take in that learning so much better if they're enjoying themselves while they're doing it. And of course, it's fun for us as those who work with young children to keep the learning fun. And lastly, there, we can use play intentionally to really ensure that children are making progress toward learning goals. And we're going to be talking about specific learning goals for young children as the course progresses. But this is just to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about when we say developmentally appropriate practice. Okay. We also want to take a look at the core considerations for DAP as outlined for the National Association for the Education of Young Children, or NACE. And at first here, thinking about that we need to have an understanding or knowledge of early childhood development and how young children progress along a continuum. So we're going to be taking a much closer look at that and what is expected of children to be able to know and understand at different ages through the preschool years. We also want to have an awareness of individual development and keep that at the forefront. So again, that's understanding what is expected at different ages and the idea that all children will develop it along the continuum, but maybe at different rates and different stages. So keeping that in the forefront of our understanding when we're planning. And then lastly, having an understanding of cultural differences and the developmental expectations of different cultures and how that may affect how a child is learning or reacting to any of the activities or things that we may do in our story times. So kind of keeping that at the forefront. And NACE is going to be a great resource for you. So there are some links you're going to notice in the readings, a link to NACE's website, also being able to download their current position statement on DAP. There's so many resources on their site, and you're going to find video clips and guidelines and examples and just so much there. So, depending on where you are in your understanding of developmentally appropriate practice, you may want to spend more or less time on this site exploring. But know that it's there for you, and the reading of looking at that position statement will be important to developing these understandings. So next we want to go to when we're choosing developmentally appropriate books, there are some key considerations that we want to look at and kind of keep at the forefront. These are basic considerations, and of course, we're going to be going into much more depth as the course progresses. But just keeping in mind that the physical size and shape and the material that it's made of books that we put in the hands of young children makes a difference. So, for instance, for babies, we want them to have board books or indestructible books because they are going to be exploring those books in much different ways than, let's say, a preschooler would be. So size and shape and material does matter in book selection. And then thinking about the pictures and illustrations in the books that we give young children and knowing that there are differences, of course, for different age ranges. So board books tend to have very simple pictures and illustrations, whereas picture books, we want to look for pictures that will both refine and extend understanding of the text. So that's another key consideration for book selection. And then a rhythm of language, books that really play with language, rhyming books, anything that gets a child really engaged with the language and rhythm of language in a book is an important consideration. Thinking about the number of words on the page, of course, for board books, there may be one or a few words on a page. There are, of course, wordless picture books. So we just want to keep in mind that we want that to match the developmental age of the child and range that we're selecting for in our story times. And then thinking about the number of pages in a book. Of course, that's very different from a board book to a picture book. So, in your reading, one of your readings this week, there'll be an outline of many different types of reading material and thinking about these different considerations. But these are just kind of the basics. So, from here, we're going to launch into an overview from Every Child Ready to Read of best practices for early literacy development. And these slides are taken from their most current workshop developed for early childhood educators. It gives a really good overview of ECRR. So again, depending on where you are in your knowledge of early literacy, this could be a review for many of you, or some of it may contain new knowledge, but we want to start with this overview. So let's launch right into that. So the first slide here is asking us to keep in mind that children's reading success in kindergarten and beyond begins with those positive language and literacy experiences from the time they're infants. So if children develop pre-reading skills before they start kindergarten, they can focus on learning to read once they begin school. So we know that children who start kindergarten ready to learn to read have greater success throughout their school years. They're more likely to read at or above grade level by the end of second grade. And actually, children who read at or above grade level by the end of fourth grade are more likely to graduate from high school and be successful readers and learners throughout their lives. So those early years matter so much. This slide lets us start taking a look and thinking about brain development. So, babies are born with billions of brain cells, also known as neurons. And at birth, though, of course, they have relatively few connections or synapses between those cells. So every time children use sensory experiences, seeing, smelling, hearing, touching, tasting, connections are being made between the brain cells. And it is through this process that learning begins to take place. So, in the first few years of life, babies make a huge number of neural connections. And the sheer quantity of synaptic connections that young children have means that their brains, they're not efficient yet. It's hard for them to distinguish what is important, what to focus on, and what is background. But around the age of 3, the brain has developed so many of those synapses and they begin to it starts the pruning process, keeping the connections that are repeated. So this knowledge really reinforces how important those early interactions are. Children need to start learning complex processes like language and other pre-literacy components while they're still forming lots of neural connections. After the first few years, it's harder to learn language, as we know. So, pre literacy activities need to begin early in order to make the most of that crucial learning period. And if you look at this slide, you can see here the number of connections at age 6 and compare it to age 14. You can begin to see how important it is to reinforce language and literacy in the early years so that strong bonds are made and reinforced for language and learning and social emotional growth during that pruning process when the synapses that are reinforced are the ones that really take hold. So, two great websites for learning more about brain development that are in our optional resources this week are 0 to 3 and also Harvard's Center on the Developing Child. And if you're truly interested in learning more about this, those are two great resources. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what early literacy is. It's what children know about communication, language, both verbal and nonverbal, reading and writing before they can actually read and write. So it encompasses all of a child's experiences with conversations, stories, books, print. It's not the teaching of reading, it's laying the foundation for reading. So that's an important point for us to keep in mind. So when we talk about oral language, it's really the foundation of literacy, of the ability to learn to read. Oral language development is the development of knowledge and skills that allow children to understand, speak, and use words to communicate. It is listening and speaking. Even deeper, it's nonverbal language like facial expressions, gestures, body language. So we know that children learn through joint attention, focusing together. So, to support joint attention, you can label objects, establish eye contact with your child briefly, and then point to and name the object. Point as you read. Look at a picture and point to show where you're looking. You can point out sounds to share too, like what do you think that noise is? Oh, I hear the birds singing. Do you hear that? So, all ways to have that joint attention and focus on that early language development. And children learn language best in a social context. They read your face and your gestures to help make sense of what you're saying. So they learn new things in context, watching what's happening around them. For example, when you give a baby a blanket and you might say something like, Nathan, here's your blanket. Here's your warm, fuzzy blanket. The child's learning from your actions as well as your words. And for older children, when they're playing, they learn as you interact with them or as they interact with one another. So pretend play is so good for this. Things like playing store, playing restaurant, or anything along those lines. And here's another brain slide here. And this is a PET scan or positron emission tomography. It measures brain activity. And what you see in this illustration is the brain activity that's involved in conversation. And you can see that it's quite a complicated process and that different parts of the brain are used for different aspects of speech. So those synapses or connections between brain cells not only have to take place within each part of the brain, but also across these four parts of the brain. So young children are still in the process of making the pathways that'll make thinking and speaking easier and quicker. And the only way these pathways can be made is through repetition and practice. So just showing this slide for us to think about why it's important to give young children plenty of time to respond when they're learning to talk. So kind of waiting 5 to 12 seconds, even though that can feel very long for a child to respond when you're having a conversation, they need time to pull upon this process. This slide has us thinking about the critical dimensions or areas of early literacy development. And the first one here being phonological awareness. You may have heard this term. It's referring to being able to hear and play with the smallest sounds in words. Then there's print awareness or conventions, and that refers to knowing that print has meaning, that's the kind of the underlying concept. It includes noticing print, understanding that printed words stand for spoken words, and knowing how a book works and the direction of text. Then there's letter knowledge and knowing letter names and understanding that letters represent sounds. Vocabulary knowledge, knowing words and their meaning, and then background knowledge. And that's thinking about prior knowledge, knowing about the world around us. And we know that strong background knowledge leads to good comprehension when children begin to learn to read. So I just described what early literacy is. And now I want to talk a little bit about the reading process when children are formally taught to read. I'm giving you an overview of the formal teaching of reading so you'll see the continuum from early literacy. It's not so that we formally teach children to read or thinking about doing that at younger and younger ages. It's just being able to understand that process and where early literacy fits in. So, the formal process of learning to read involves two key skill areas: learning a code or decoding. Children must learn how to decode print. They need to understand that the words they hear and say can be written with letters. That's the code. They need to learn that letters represent the sounds that they hear in words. So that's that phonological awareness piece tying in. They need to understand the meaning, and that's comprehension. So children need to understand or comprehend what print says. They need to learn the meaning of individual words, and they need to understand the meaning of the books or the stories that they read. So those are the two key areas. So remember that children need these two parts. So for decoding, children need to develop the following early literacy skill areas that are outlined on this slide. They need that phonological awareness piece, being able to hear and play with the smaller sounds and words. Children have to be able to pay attention to those sounds in words in order to learn how to match letters to those sounds when they're learning to read. Then there's that print awareness and the conventions of print. So noticing print, understanding that printed words stand for spoken words, and knowing that print is read from left to right and top to bottom, at least in the English language. And then letter knowledge, knowing letter names and that they represent sounds, and knowing the same letter can look different. So, knowing letter names and sounds and being able to hear and play with the sounds in words, phonological awareness, those are the strongest predictors of early reading success through grade 2, that decoding piece. So, we've talked about decoding as being able to match letters with sounds in order to sound out words. As adults, we know the code. But here's an activity to help us think about this process for a young child that's just learning to read. So look at this here, look at the code and look at the message and see if you can decode the message. Okay, so I'm going to pull it up here. And of course, it's I can read. So, what steps did you take to decode this sentence? You decoded the message by matching the symbols to letters and sounds to read the words. You read the words from left to right because you know the directionality of print. So, learning to decode is the purpose of phonics instruction in school. And going back to our previous slide, you can see how the early literacy skills of phonological awareness and letter knowledge can help set the stage for this instruction. Now, The second key part or component that young children need in order to eventually learn to read is comprehension. And comprehension requires building these early literacy skills, vocabulary and background knowledge. So, vocabulary, of course, is knowing words and their meaning. And background knowledge is knowing about the world around us, the prior knowledge that the child has about the world before entering school. So, the more background knowledge children have, the easier it will be for them to understand what they read, to make connections, and to comprehend. Background knowledge also includes print motivation, enjoyment of books and readings, which you all do so well in your story times, and also narrative skills, knowing how stories work. So, children's exposure to enjoyable experiences around books and stories helps them develop print motivation, creating the enjoyment around books and reading that will help them stick with learning to read even when it's difficult. So, supporting their narrative skills by recounting stories and events teaches them how stories work, that they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And later, when they really learn story structure, knowing that there's usually main characters and there's going to be a problem, and they're going to work through the problem and have a solution to the problem at the end, at least in those early stories that we share. So those are those good narrative skills that young children who are read to a lot and exposed to many books develop. So if you look at this slide, your brain automatically goes to Leah is happy when she reads with her mom, right? So the point here is that children can learn to decode words, but not understand what they mean. So that's why phonics is only one part of reading instruction in school. If you don't know what Hipple and Roths mean here, you do not know what the sentence means. So, to become good readers, children must decode words and interpret their meaning. These are skills children need to begin to develop before they actually learn to read. And that's why it's important to start now to get children ready to learn to read. So, let's talk a little bit more about decoding and comprehension skills. Okay. Another point to make when we're talking about all of this is that we want to encourage parents to use the language they know best. If English is not the parent's first language, encourage them to speak to their child in the language that they know best. This allows them to have conversations with their child more fluently. Encourage your parents to describe objects, feelings, actions, etc. And by doing so, it's going to create a better language foundation for the child than if they were trying to do the same in English. It's important for parents to understand that speaking with their child in the parent's first language will actually help their child's literacy development in both languages. So, when we're talking about comprehension, we want to think about the fact that all early literacy skills begin at birth, but since comprehension predicts children's school success from grades 4 and up and predicts high school graduation, we want to really think about how we can begin to develop these early understandings. So, within the area of comprehension, let's take a look at vocabulary. Vocabulary is knowing words and their meanings, as we said. And these quotes here really talk about the importance of vocabulary development, what a huge predictor they are to children's success. And that we know that the more words we expose children to, the more we talk and interact with them, the more we read to them, and that let them hear and play and understand that complex language, the better and stronger their vocabularies will be. And vocabulary is important not only for comprehension, but it's also important for decoding words. It's easier to decode a word or sound out a word that you've heard before than one you've never heard. So children can enter school with a huge word gap or word range, let's say. Um, while there's debate about what that gap can actually be, we know that children who have many, many experiences with vocabulary development, talking, reading, all that interaction, they're going to build a stronger vocabulary, and this is going to make a huge difference for them as they learn to read. So, when sharing books, for instance, with babies, you're going to say more words that are written in the books. So, where it says here, in your own words, the more words a child hears, the more they're going to know. So, you can use pictures as conversation starters. Talk about what you know. In general, just keeping in mind that picture books have 3 times as many rare words as we use in conversation with young children. So children hear more words when we read to them. And this will make it easier for them to understand what they read when they're taught to read. So, just another reason why reading to young children is so important. To become successful readers, children need to understand the meaning of what they read, and making sense of written language or comprehension is at the heart of what it means to be a good reader. Successful reading depends on the decoding skills needed to read the words quickly and accurately, but to a much greater extent, successful reading depends on the comprehension skills needed to understand what is being read. A rich store of background knowledge and a strong foundation in language experiences will set the stage for reading comprehension. And that's what we're trying to do with early literacy, set that stage. So, the more rich language experiences children have, the more experiences they have to learn about their world. This helps them make connections between what is being read to them or what they will later read, and it's the key to comprehension. When we think about background knowledge, it means prior knowledge. What do children know about their world before they enter school? So, background knowledge can be divided into 3 areas. We can think about conceptual thinking or abstract thinking. So, one example of this kind of thinking is object permanence, knowing that something exists even when you can't see it. So, children start developing this around 8 months old. Another example is symbolic thinking, using one object or idea to represent another. For instance, using a block to represent a cell phone, or recognizing that a stick figure represents a person. Language itself involves symbolic thinking. Pictures and text represent real things that exist in the world. Then there's content knowledge, and this is children's general knowledge about the world and subject knowledge. You can describe and label pictures in a book, for example, or encourage children to tell you what they know and ask questions or share information you know, whether or not it is in the book. Using factual books is one key way to support content knowledge or nonfiction. And then we want to think about books and story knowledge. And there are 2 aspects to book and story knowledge: print motivation and story structure. So, print motivation is learning to enjoy books and reading. Children who have lots of positive experiences around books and reading are more likely to stick with learning to read longer when they are formally taught to read, even if it's difficult. You can support print motivation, for example, at all different age ranges, letting babies handle those board books and chew on them, use them as toys, letting children choose the books that they want to read together. And then there's understanding story structure or narrative structure, how stories work with a beginning, a middle, and end, as we talked about. And that can be supported by helping children tell stories and develop narrative skills, the ability to retell a story that you've read to them or recount events of their day. And this understanding will help children be able to describe and understand the sequence of events in stories when they're learning to read. So being able to retell stories in their own words also increases children's comprehension of the story itself. So it's an important early literacy concept to understand. Now, when we look at these early literacy skills, we've just looked at the ones that are critical, and that support comprehension, vocabulary, and background knowledge. And as I mentioned before, these are the skills that predict reading success in grades 4 and up, and they predict high school graduation as well. These early literacy skills start at birth. We cannot wait until children start school to start developing these skills. And when we talk about decoding skills, which are needed as children learn to sound out words, they include phonological awareness, print awareness, and conventions of print, and letter knowledge. So we've got a brief overview of those two main skill areas that go into a child learning to read, right? So children develop decoding and comprehension skills through interactions with adults and their environment, especially when we're talking about early literacy and getting them ready for that formal reading instruction. So, for early literacy, these interactions are practiced by talking, singing, reading, writing, and playing. And you may have heard those mentioned as the 5 practices of ECRR. So we're going to take a look at those in depth at each one. So, children learn language by listening to their parents and caregivers talk. And as they hear spoken words, children learn how individual words sound, which helps them later decode words. They learn what words mean, which increases their vocabulary. They learn how words can be put together to communicate ideas and information, which leads to comprehension. So the kind of serve and return, and you'll hear that mentioned at Harvard Center on the Developing Child, but the serve and return of conversation, that conversation is turn talking. That is such an important practice with young children. So when you talk with children, you want to use new words. Good readers have a large vocabulary, as we said. So, knowing lots of words helps children better understand what they read. Begin this early, even before the children learn to talk. When you're talking to them and expanding on what you're seeing and talking about a board book or anything along those lines, even before children learn to talk, they are soaking in all that language and their receptive language is building. You can take turns. Children that are just beginning to learn how to have a conversation, it's important for you to ask questions and then listen to what the children say in response. And the response may be the use of gestures or facial expressions and then eventually words. And make connections. Help children remember past events and connect them to current and future activities when you're having conversations. This helps children develop an understanding that language can represent events that are not happening right now, but that happened in the past or that may happen or you're planning to happen in the future. And we want to always keep in mind, as we said, that books are wonderful conversation starters. And there's so many ways to use a book to have a conversation with young children. You can look at the cover together. You can point out the title and the author and talk about the illustration on the cover and ask the child what they think the story is going to be about. You can kind of walk through the book page by page without going all the way to the end and giving it away, but you can talk a little bit about it. That's called having a picture walk, and let children make some predictions about what's going to happen. And that's not really reading the book. A picture walk is having a conversation about the story prior to reading to engage the children in the story and develop background knowledge. So, another good practice to keep in mind when you're using the practice of talking and specifically with books. Now we're going to talk a bit about singing. So, songs are such a natural way to learn about language, and songs help children develop listening skills and pay attention to the rhythms and the rhymes of spoken language. And singing helps them to develop phonological awareness as children learn to tune their ears to the sounds in words. So most songs have a distinct note for each syllable. So this helps children break down words so that they're starting to hear those individual sounds in a word. And singing also slows down language so children can hear different parts of words and notice how they are alike and different. Clapping along to rhythms helps children hear the syllables in words and helps them improve their motor skills. And singing also helps children learn new words and adds to their general knowledge. In this way, it contributes to vocabulary and comprehension skills as well. So, just in this little song of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, there's so many literacy skills you can build. And just using any little songs like this with infants and toddlers, they're going to love hearing you sing. And children love the sound of your voice, whether you're a parent or you're in story time. We tend to be critical of our own voices, but children will not be. They love to hear you sing and to sing along. Um, when we talk about reading, well, no matter what their age is, reading together with children or shared reading is the single most important activity that you can do to help children get ready to read. Shared reading is valuable because a child has your full attention and you're enjoying the experience together. Shared reading helps a child develop a love of reading and an appreciation of books. Children who enjoy being read to are more likely to want to learn to read themselves. A key understanding here. And a child's interest in reading is an important predictor of later reading achievement. So, whether as a parent reading one-on-one with a child, you in story time sharing books with the children, reading to a child is just so important, such an important practice. And we also want to help parents know ways to share books with their children. Reading together and talking about what you read will increase children's vocabulary and their background knowledge. It helps them learn how books work and how written language looks. And it gives them an understanding of how stories are organized, that they have a beginning, middle, and end, as we talked about. And it also encourages imaginative thinking. So many benefits from sharing books. And other points to keep in mind. Remember how we said that learning vocabulary is something that begins at birth and continues throughout school? Well, shared reading is one of the best ways to help children learn vocabulary. Knowing more words helps children learn to read more easily, and we want parents to know this. So, children learn more new words from shared reading. Books can teach less common words, words that children might not hear in everyday conversation. Reading is the best way to introduce these rare words or less common words. Take time to explain what the words mean. You can do this before the story begins so that you don't interrupt the story as you read it, or you can do it in context as you go. So sometimes a book may lend itself to one or another or a combination of those strategies. But we want to remember always that children who have larger vocabularies are more likely to become better readers. And talking about writing when we're talking about early literacy. Well, reading and writing go together, and both are ways to represent spoken words and to communicate information or tell stories. Children become aware that printed letters stand for spoken words as they see print used in their daily lives. They see their parents and others read newspapers or food labels or road signs or mail. They may watch caregivers write down lists or jot down reminders or make notes on a calendar. Children develop a knowledge of the purpose and meaning of reading through writing. And once a child can grasp a thick crayon or a marker, give him or her unlined paper and plenty of opportunities to draw and write. Talking to children about what they draw, asking questions, responding to what they say. You can make up a story to go with the drawing, but it's important to let them have those early writing experiences that will build understanding. So, this slide shows the development of writing. And as children scribble and draw, they practice eye-hand coordination and exercise the muscles in their fingers and hands. And this helps them develop the fine motor skill control that they're going to need to write letters and words. So even when you do finger plays and other activities that develop their hands and finger muscles, you are supporting later writing. So, palmar grasp of infants holding a crayon with the palm, the way the child holds your finger, the pincer grasp, the index finger and thumb together, picking up Cheerios. All those things contribute to how the child later grasps a pencil. So, the use of scissors involves the same muscles used for writing. Turning pages in a book helps develop fine motor skills that later support writing skills. So many ways to developmentally appropriately develop those writing skills. You can encourage children to sign their names on their drawings, even if this begins as a scribble. Children learn that they can write something that represents their name. And later, a child will write the initials of his or her first and last name, and then their complete name. You can ask children to label parts of their drawings. This helps them understand that letters and words stand for things. Initially, you may want to do labeling for them and let them tell you what to write. And as their knowledge of letters and sounds develops, they they may begin to write the first letter of a word on their own. For example, M for mom or D for dad. You can encourage them to share the pencil with you, which will later develop their understanding of how letters stand for the sounds in words. Like any activity with young children, you want to keep it fun and engaging and stop if they lose interest. But we want parents to know, if you're looking at this slide, that writing develops along a continuum, much like everything else, and that scribbling is an important first step. It's fine if your child is scribbling. You want them to do that. You want them to have that marker or crayon in their hands as soon as they can grasp it, because that is developing writing skills as far as early literacy goes. And finally, playing. Children learn about language through different kinds of play. It's one of the best ways for children to learn language and literacy skills. Play helps children think symbolically. A ruler can become a magic wand, or today becomes a time when dinosaurs were alive, or a playmate can become an astronaut learning about space. So, through play, children realize that one thing can stand for another, and this helps children understand that written words stand for real objects and experiences. And pretend play helps children think symbolically and develop oral language skills as well. We talked a little bit about pretend play earlier. As children play store or pretend to be an animal, they talk about what they're doing and they practice putting their thoughts into words. So, dramatic play helps develop narrative skills as children make up a story about what they're doing. And this helps them understand that stories happen in an order first, next, last. Um, Make believe also gives children a chance to act out real life situations, work through problem solving. So it can also give children a real sense of accomplishment and self confidence. And this motivates them to try new experiences and to not give up when something seems difficult. So you really want to have play materials available as appropriate in your story times or after your story times. Um, Anything that's going to encourage this pretend play and signify its importance for parents. So we've gone through our overview here of ECRR. And I hope that either reinforced or gave you some new understandings about early literacy development and developmentally appropriate practice. So to look back at our week one at a glance here, you're going to go ahead and do the assignment of introducing yourself and then take a look at the different readings, explore the different websites that are available. If something is listed as optional, if you want to explore that further, it will only add to your strong knowledge base. And I hope you have a great week exploring everything, and I will see you for week two.